Hi guys, Andrew here with Headphones.com. Today we're going to take a look at the DCA Stealth planar magnetic over-ear closed-back headphone that comes in right at around $4,000. So this is a Summit flagship top-tier headphone, and seemingly I've lost my voice today, but that's okay. We're going to push on with the review anyways. Let's check it out. All right, so let me get a quick disclaimer out of the way here. The Stealth was sent over by DCA for evaluation, so big thanks to DCA for sending it in for review. But I've not been paid to say anything in particular about it, and of course all thoughts and opinions are my own. Additionally, if you guys are interested in the measurements that have been done of this headphone, I will have already posted those up on the Headphone Community Forum. There'll be a link in the description for that, but I've also done a full written review of this headphone, which will be linked below as well. So if you're curious about the written version of this, and you want sort of more of a deep dive on that, feel free to check that out as well. Now, let's get into the review, and some of you might be wondering why I'm just holding up a black case with the word Stealth on it, and that's actually because the headphones are inside. That's right, they fold up and are portable in this case. Actually, it's very similar to the Aeon Noir's case as well. If you guys are familiar with that headphone, it's the same idea. And so when you, let me just unzip that. When you take it out of the case, you can see it extends here like the other one does as well, like the Noir does as well. So it's the same idea for the design. This is something that DCA have definitely put a lot of work and effort into. It's making these collapsible and portable, and obviously they're closed back as well. So that all kind of feeds into the same idea, which is fantastic in my opinion. Now for build quality, I liked what DCA did with the Noir, and actually all of their headphones I've really enjoyed the build quality of. But with the Stealth, it feels like they've sort of taken that up another level, as one might expect with a $4,000 headphone, right? It's much more expensive. Not only is the carbon fiber more of a matte finish rather than that sort of glossy look that the other one has, all of the rest of this feels like metal. With all the different components, the Stealth just feels like another step up as far as the overall build quality is concerned, including the headband system, which I think, like for me, this headband system is an improvement. So let's get into the comfort next. Now, as much as I think DCA headphones in general are very comfortable for most people, I did have somewhat of an issue with the original Aeons being a little bit too much on their clamp for me because I got a large head. And with the Noir, or at least with the new pads that they put on, it seemed to alleviate that issue for me. And so that main issue comes from sort of the clamp force being not really adjustable. The clamp force is basically just there, and all of the absorption is done by the pads. And that's not a bad thing. And these pads are, I want to say these are like the best and softest and most cushiony pads that I've seen from DCA yet. So that's great. However, I think the suspension style system is going to be hit and miss for certain people. For me, it's a big hit. I much prefer the suspension style headband to this older style that they used on this one. And I actually like it better than what was going on with the Ether 2 as well. So I like that a lot, but the one consideration is that when you put it on, let me just show you what that looks like. It is a little bit on the snug side, but not in a way that's bad. So, if you want something to fit really loose and just sort of hang there, that's not this headphone. This very much sort of encloses in, and it does create actually pretty good isolation as well. So this is one of the more isolating headphones, certainly more isolating than the LCD XC that I've been comparing it to as well. But getting back to the comfort here, this is still reasonably lightweight, but it is a little heavier than the Noir. Let me just actually take this out because there we go. So it's a little bit heavier than the Noir, but I don't find that to be an issue at all. The only issue, I think, for the overall comfort for me is that this protrudes a little bit further down, like the bottom part here protrudes a little bit further down towards the bottom part of my jaw, and that is where I feel sort of the brunt of the clamp. Kind of almost reminiscent of like what happens with the Annette. Not quite to that degree, but those Hi-Fi Man egg-shaped headphones, they also kind of do that same thing where they go very far down. So I think, it might not be perfect for everybody, but I think for most people this is going to be pretty good. And the fact that it's lightweight, that's already like a big win, because a lot of these like really high-end headphones are, especially the closed-back ones, they're way heavier than this. So I had no problem getting through a full day of work wearing this, and I didn't feel like my neck was being dragged down like sometimes happens with a lot of other headphones, actually. There's one other consideration that I don't really think it's related to comfort, but it's something you might notice. And I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but on the inside of the cup, they have what they've called here their AMTS. So this is basically their waveguide resonator tuning filter, all kind of wrapped in one. And what's going on here is they've figured out how to model different frequencies, and I'll get into that a little bit with the frequency response and the tuning. But there's essentially this material piece that has a whole bunch of holes in it on the inside of the cup, and that I find, because I've got larger ears, occasionally the backside of my ear will come into contact with this piece. Now, it's not an impediment to comfort for me. It doesn't make it less comfortable, but it is just something that I noticed. Now, let's get into the sound quality here next, but I do also want to let you guys know that I've been running this off of, a wide range of amplifiers. So I ran the Stealth off of everything from the topping A90 to the Vioelectric HPA V550 to the Burson Conductor to the Kine IHA6 to the SBL Phonitor X. And a number of other ones as well. I found that I liked it the best out of the Vioelectric and then the Kine HA6. I wasn't as keen on the A90 and the SPL Phonitor X. It sounded a little bit softer on those, whereas a little bit more lively and engaging on the other two. But let's get into the sound quality here next. So first, let's talk about the objective stuff, the frequency response, the measurements, and all of that. And again, I have to state as clearly as possible before this section every time that I'll throw the graphs up on the screen here, but adherence to a target is not the only indicator for good sound quality. That target there is just a known data point. It's a known reference point. And there are places where the headphone's frequency response can deviate from this target. And there are also places where it should deviate from this target, specifically at around 9K. So don't just think that adherence and deviation from a target is, the only thing that there is. There's more to it than that. However, with that out of the way, looking at the frequency response of the DCA Stealth, you can see that the bass here is elevated sufficiently to match the Harman shelf, and there's a little bit of a boost there in the mid bass, but I'm told that that's actually to compensate for the lack of distortion that this headphone has, which is quite impressive. So they felt that they needed to kind of add a little bit more there just to give it a little bit of extra thump, which is quite nice to see. I think it's totally fine there as well. And then it does follow the Harman contour there, so there's a bit of a dip in the upper bass, lower mid range there, and that's again part of the preference curve. I like this for closed back headphones. I really think this works, even though I don't think it's entirely necessary, but this does work quite well for me at least. And then you can see it actually follows the target all the way up. It has the right amount of ear gain. This is the interesting thing though. The only thing that I would adjust is I would reduce that ear gain by just like 1 to 2 dB. And the reason for that is because the mid treble is also just a little bit relaxed there. And in my opinion, how versatile a headphone's frequency response is for a wide range of genres often comes down to the relationship between the upper mid-range and the lower treble, or lower and mid-treble. When I'm listening to stuff with electric guitars and that kind of more aggressive and intense music, I actually kind of prefer less ear gain there in general, and so that would be the only time that I would really adjust that down. Now, I also find this kind of interesting because there is a trend for high-end, like ultra summit flagship headphones to boost the upper treble like crazy, like that upper air shimmery stuff. And with the Stealth, it doesn't. In my opinion, not doing that, not boosting it like crazy, is the more correct sound. And really, there's only a handful of these like Summit, top tier flagship headphones that have this kind of, correct balance or more appropriate balance. And the Stealth is definitely one of them. So, for those who are looking for that super extra, ultra exciting, upper treble air shimmery stuff, this doesn't have that, but I think that's a good thing. I'd rather it be this kind of tuning because this gives a little bit more focus. If you listen to a cymbal hit on this, it sounds the way that a cymbal hit sounds in real life. So that's fairly important to me as a former drummer. I mean, I tend to notice these things, like when there's that upper shimmering edge. I find it quite annoying, and that's one of the things that I typically EQ down on a lot of those flagship headphones. Now, I'll get into the subjective stuff here in a second, but before doing that, I just want to kind of address the tuning system, or AMTS, and the use of this as opposed to these former tuning filters that they used to use, which I am not a fan of. Because we have to remember that this is a closed back planar magnetic headphone. And so closed-back headphones in general are very difficult to get the tuning right. You inevitably need to do a whole bunch of damping to get the tuning right. And with planar magnetics, that's even more difficult. It's extremely difficult to tune a closed-back planar magnetic headphone to get it to be exactly how you want it to be. Whereas with the open-back headphones, you don't have any resonances or standing waves that are going to reflect off the back and go back into the ear. They're just going to go out. And so what DCA have done is they've basically implemented this piece that sits in front of the driver, in between the driver and the ear. It's a piece that's essentially a very sophisticated waveguide and tuning filter that will surgically boost or reduce various different resonances, peaks and dips and things like that to get the frequency response to be as good as it is. And that's really the reason why you see that there. Now, I'm also told that most of what this affects, so the frequencies that are affected by this, are in the lower treble and above, and that's also where you would see sort of the worst offenders of the frequency response resonances and dips and things like that. So all the lower information like the bass and the sub bass and the lower mids and all that stuff, that's achieved through the housing and the pads and all the rest of the design. And even though the resonance frequency on this headphone is actually still quite high, which is something that I've talked about in the past, they were able to actually achieve that full sub bass extension with a bass boost, and then sort of account for the upper frequencies with this tuning system, the metamaterials tuning system. Now, it's interesting because I'm not traditionally a fan of putting stuff in front of the driver, and I think there are good reasons not to do that. One of the previous solutions had been these tuning filters, but the problem with this is that this would sort of blunt the detail. I mean, yes, it would change the frequency response as well. It would kind of reduce sort of a wider range of frequencies, and it couldn't be as surgical. And while they are effective for curbing the treble on some of these other headphones like the Aeons, if anybody's a little bit more sensitive there, they would then use these to kind of bring some of that treble down a little bit. But I always found that I prefer to just EQ them down because this would cause that sort of blunted effect for the trailing ends of tones. It would just sort of lop that off a little bit, the thicker or the more attenuation that there was. And so with the AMTS system, this doesn't have that problem. This does not cause any of the blunting that these did. So I am a big fan of doing it this way rather than the regular tuning filter, the previous tuning filter way. And so I'm actually very excited to see the future applications of the AMTS system here. AMTS is the system, of the AMTS, because this is a much more precise and elegant way of doing that sort of tuning for a closed back planar like this, rather than just trying to get it close with these types of things and incurring some trade-offs there. You're able to get it actually as accurate as you might want with a more surgical tuning system here. So I think this is really interesting, and I'm looking forward to what they do next with this system. Basically, I'm now expecting their headphones to all be tuned exceptionally well, when they implement this, because that is definitely unique, and I think it's effective. Now, that leads me into the subjective stuff, all of the technical performance and that stuff, which I just have to be clear here. This is just my subjective experience with this. This is how it sounds to me. But let's get into it, and I'll let you guys know kind of how this stacks up relative to some of the other flagship headphones, including some closebacks some high-end closebacks that I've been comparing with. But I want to also mention how they compare against some of their other headphones as well. So let's begin by talking about detail retrieval. And I tend to evaluate detail in a number of ways. For those who aren't familiar, there's sort of the immediacy of the initial leading edge and what contributes to it sounding kind of fast and tight. And then there's also the clarity for the trailing ends of tones. And the absence of this is what I mentioned before, that sort of blunting and lopped off quality. If you're wondering about a good example of that, the Drop Panda is probably the worst offender at that. But for that quality, the Stealth is excellent. I don't have it doesn't sound blunted in any way. You're not leaning forward to kind of try and hear more that is there because you've heard it on other headphones. It's all there with this. So there are no negative issues there. However, I also don't find it to be quite as clear for the trailing ends of tones as something like the LCD4 here. Which I know is an open back headphone, and I'll compare it to closed backs in a second, but we're talking about $4,000 headphones, this sort of summit tier headphones. And so for that sense of detail, the balance between the initial leading edge and the clarity for the trailing ends of tones, the Stealth, in my opinion, at least how I hear it, is good, but not great, right? It's not quite up there with the $6,000 Svara or the Vocal Utopia, but it's also not far behind, and I do hear it as a bit of a step up from the Ether 2. Now, the second way in which I evaluate detail is to take a listen for the instrument separation and the distinctness and the ability to isolate the individual lines in busy passages. How well does it sort of keep up with a lot of stuff going on? And for that quality, I hear the Stealth as being absolutely competitive with other top-tier flagship headphones, like its competition. In some ways, it almost sounds like there's an outline or a sense of distance between all the different images. You can very easily hear the different elements in vocal harmonies or guitar harmonies and things like that. So while I don't quite hear this on the same level as like the Final Audio D8000 Pro or the LCD4, Hi-Fi Svara, and some of those, it's not at all far behind those. And then for that separation quality, I think it's right up there. So that's fantastic. For soundstage, this is one that actually threw me for a loop initially when I first listened to this. I'm gonna say the soundstage on this is actually medium. And the reason why it threw me off a little bit was because of how well separated it all was, and how sort of distinct all the different lines are. But also in saying that this has a more medium soundstage and sort of overall sense of space to it, there is also a very precise range of where the image placement can be. So sometimes I would hear guitar tones or vocals as very close to me, with the rest of the mix quite a bit further away. The percussive instruments maybe a little bit further away there. And so in that sense, it gives a very sort of 3D or depth focused presentation overall. And lastly, for the sense of punch and slam and impact, and call it macro contrast, macro dynamics, whatever you want to call it there, I don't really get that much going on here either. It's definitely better than what you get on the original Aeons, but in general, this still has a little bit of a softer presentation. But actually, in saying that, this does kind of compensate for that a little bit by having that elevated bass response. So while it doesn't have the slam and contrast quality that a lot of people like, the perception of that can often be compensated for by a boosted bass response, because that's kind of where you often hear that quality the most commonly, even though I don't think it's uniquely associated with bass. But in any case, if you're thinking about comparisons, this isn't going to take your head off like an HE6 is going to. This is a little bit closer to that sort of more refined character of the Hi-Fi HE1000 series and the Aria and stuff like that. And briefly before we get to the comparisons here, the timbre on this, it is still a planar, so it has that sort of plucked character to it that I actually quite like. But if you're looking for that more natural kind of presentation, you'll be looking more at like a biocellulose kind of dynamic driver or something like that. All right, now let's do some comparisons here. So compared to the DCA Ether 2. It's no secret I wasn't a huge fan of the Ether 2, mostly for its tuning. And actually, I did test this with the different pads that are on it. The only aspect that I think that the Ether 2 is going to do a little bit better on is the general sense of space. But looking at the other two closebacks here, so we have here the original Aeon. When I was comparing these two against each other, this was a very strong difference, a very significant difference. So if you're wondering about where diminishing returns kick in, it's not really a close comparison at all between these two. But actually, I got to say, I was pleasantly surprised by the frequency response of the original Aeon as well. But the Stealth is just a little bit better. So the Stealth has quite a bit more bass going on. It follows that contour a little bit more. So I thought this was kind of a fun comparison because you had two headphones that generally measure well, that sound very different from one another, and markedly better on the Stealth, even though they have a similar kind of shape and a lot of similar kind of design ideas behind them. And then moving up to the Noir, which is based on the Aeon 2, just with the different pads here. These are the perforated pads on the Noir, which make it also a little bit more bass elevated, much more similar to the Stealth. The Stealth basically fills in any of the small quirks, the frequency response quirks that existed with the Noir. Even though the Noir was excellent already, the Stealth just sort of takes it up another notch. But I actually did find it interesting that the Noir also doesn't have any of that sort of bluntedness. Going back to the original Aeon here, the Aeon, as much as at its price point, I don't have that many issues with the technical performance. It kind of walks the line a little bit there between, perfectly resolving for the trailing ends of tones and being just on the edge of that bluntedness. So the Aeon 2 Noir is definitely more resolving for detail than the original. And then, it is a step up again to the Stealth, but not as dramatic, not as significant a step up. One of the things that I also really liked about the Aeon Noir was that it made it so that I didn't have to use these tuning filters. With the original Aeon 2, I needed this, I would just EQ it, but I would recommend using this because the treble was just a little too intense. And with the new pads, the perforated pads here, you don't need to do that at all. I think it's fantastic. But I'm going to do a couple more comparisons here because you guys are probably wondering, how does the Stealth compare to the other flagship closed-back headphones or high-end closed-back headphones? Compared to the Focal Stellia, this is a more interesting comparison because the Stellia does well at things that I find that the Stealth doesn't do quite so well. However, the Stealth does well at the things that the Stellia doesn't do quite as well at. The Stellia is the one that's going to punch quite a bit harder than this one. And then the trade-off goes back the other way when it comes to the frequency response and overall tuning, which I think the Stealth is also better at. Now, they're both portable, they're both comfortable, so I think it's a bit of a wash there, depends on what you like. But really, I think that's what's going to come down to between the two. Do you prefer that sort of punch and impact of the Stellia, or do you prefer the separation qualities and the frequency response of the Stealth? And in the Stellia, it's actually just more of that mid-bass focus in general. So for me, I prefer the tuning of the Stealth. Now, compared to the Sennheiser HD820, which is almost like half the price, the Sennheiser HD820 is nowhere near as good for its frequency response as the Stealth. The detail for the trailing ends of tones is pretty close, actually, because it's actually pretty good on the HD820. But this does also have better instrument separation and distinctness because, well, it's a planar as well, so it has that advantage. And lastly, I have to compare this to the Verite Open, the ZMF Verite Open, because I do not have a closed. You guys are always asking me, how does it compare against the ZMF Verite Closed? I do not have one. Maybe Zach can send me one at some point. I should reach out again. We've been talking about it for a while, just we haven't gotten around because I'm sure he's really busy. But compared to the ZMF Verite Open, when it comes to detail, I'm going to say it's very close between the two. But the frequency response of the Stealth is definitely better than the Verite Open. I think it would be a closer comparison with the Closed. You'll end up with a lot more body and richness of tone with the Verite Closed because it doesn't, it has a little bit of a dip there, but the overall kind of lower mids is a little warmer. Whereas the Stealth, I think, is the one that's the more clinical there. But certainly when compared with the Open, the Stealth is a lot more balanced there throughout the upper mids and treble. I tend to think that which one you should go for should also depend on the qualities that you are most looking for in a headphone. If you want, perfect adherence to the Harman target, then the Stealth is the way to go, right? That has that, emphasis towards clarity for the tuning. Whereas on the Verite, you're going to get the benefits of that punch and slam. It's going to be a little bit on the warmer side. It's going to be a little bit more euphonic. And so maybe folks who are looking for that more natural kind of character are going to gravitate more towards that as well. So I don't think it's as straightforward like, one is better than the other. As I consistently mention, it all really depends on which qualities you value more. Because at this point, it's not just like saying, A sounds better than B. But in any case, I did find the Stealth to be competitive for certain things with the Verite Open, and I imagine the same would be true against the Closed, because I actually think that the Verite Closed has a more balanced frequency response than the Open. All right, so that does it for the comparisons. I guess I should probably give my conclusion now. Do I recommend the DCA Stealth? And the answer to this is going to be a little bit more of a nuanced one. If you look at the landscape at around $4,000, there are definitely some headphones out there that have better subjective technical performance for some of these qualities like detail and dynamics and whatever else, soundstage, etc. But you have to consider the other fact that the Stealth is a closed back, lightweight, comfortable planar magnetic headphone with a fantastic frequency response that most of those other headphones don't have. And that really means that there is quite literally nothing else like this on the market other than the Aeon 2 Noir. At obviously a much lower price tag. And so I think whether or not this is the right headphone for you should probably be determined both by the tuning and frequency response benefits that this has, and then also the form factor and the use case, right? Are you somebody who needs a closed back headphone? Are you wearing headphones all day? Would you ever consider using it portably? I think those are the considerations that should play a very prominent role in your decision to purchase this over something else. And then I think it's worth asking yourself for that particular use case, the closed back portable headphone, comfortable, etc., with a good frequency response, do you really care to get that last, little bit of detail and that last little bit of, frequency response over something like the Noir? For a comfortable, portable, closed-back planar magnetic headphone that you can wear all day, the Noir already kind of does that. Anyways, that's going to do it for this video. Thanks for taking the time to watch it, and I'm going to see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.